on the western fringes of the highly developed culture of Mesopotamia and just north of Egypt, evolved a little-known and unimpressive race of people known as the Hebrews. Their genetic heritage was probably established in Babylonian Mesopotamia. The Hebrews' contribution was hardly military. Even at its greatest extent, their empire under the greatest king, Solomon, hardly extended beyond what would be known as Palestine today. Their contribution was not in the area of astronomy or science. The major contribution of the Hebrew people to the development of the Western tradition was ethical and normal. It was religious and moral. It was philosophical rather than political. Despite conquest, exile, and dispersal, despite persecution lasting even into the 20th century, the Hebrew people throughout history have retained a commitment to God and the law that He gave them, set forth in what is more commonly known as the Old Testament. The Hebrews were not philosophers. They were particularly concerned with the operations of nature. They were religious and moral people. They conceived of a God who was monotheistic, fully sovereign, and transcendent. He was the God of goodness and mercy, and this was a profound break with the religious beliefs of Near Eastern peoples. Those of you who are familiar with the development of the Hebrew people as described in the Bible will know that the founder of what became the distinctively Hebrew nation was a man named Abraham. He lived in Ur, a town southeast of the city of Babylon. On an impulse at what he described as stimulation or encouragement from God, he left his home and his kinsmen and became for time an immigrant at God's prompting until he was told to settle. He went first to the northern Euphrates Valley and then turned southwest, ran down the western rim of the Fertile Crescent, and settled in what is now known today as Palestine. In Abraham's day, Palestine was known as Canaan. They also created a sacred scripture that chronicled the relationship between the people and their God, Yahweh. And these books have helped the Hebrews maintain their identity down to the present day. So much so that unlike other ancient peoples, they resisted absorption by the years and the waves of conquerors that passed over Southwest Asia. There is a tantalizing hint of the early Hebrews as they interacted with other cultures. Many of the tribes, if not all, had been among the foreigners who lived in Egypt during the New Kingdom, around 1000 to 1500 BC. Look at the time frame of Akhenaten's experiment with monotheism, and the probable presence of Hebrews in Egypt is palpable. It is not within the realm of reason, it is not beyond the realm of reason to suggest or suspect that this abortive new flirtation with a new religion might have come as a result of Hebrew influence on the Egyptian court. Hebrew tradition says that a great leader, Moses, whose name is Egyptian, not Hebrew, by the way, led the collective tribes out of Egypt to the Sinai desert, where he, or God, gave them the tribal groups a law, the Ten Commandments, which was then elaborated in the book of Deuteronomy, the second law. And after his formative period under Moses, around 1200 BC, the Hebrews invaded Palestine under Moses' assistant, Joshua. These were two fundamental there were two fundamental characteristics of religion in the ancient Middle East. First, most ancient cultures say gods everywhere were in nature: the moon, the stars, rivers and mountains, thunder, windstorms. They were all either gods or doing the dwelling, they were either gods or the dwelling places of gods or doing the bidding of gods. Myths were invented to explain in human terms why events took place. Stories about God's birth, their deeds, their death, their resurrection gave explanation as to the difficulties of life so as to make the brutish life experienced by most people more palatable. The second characteristic of ancient Near Eastern religions was a set of gods that were not sovereign. People believed that the gods got their power from a prior existence. Gods grew old, gods grew sick, gods required food, gods died. There were certain limitations on divine power. They were subjected to the forces of magic and fate, and if they messed up, they were punished. But for the Hebrews, God was not only one, but was sovereign, transcendent, above nature. Nature and its objects were not divine. Nature and its objects were not divine. They were only God's creations. There were no limitations on God. He was fully sovereign. He himself was the arbiter of right and wrong and determined the way life was to be lived. This led to a whole new way of looking at people. Instead of being faceless members of a mass humanity, buffeted by a sometimes capricious set of gods, but they were individuals who dealt with God directly, with the freedom to choose morally between good and evil. From that we derive the idea that the individual is worth something and possesses great dignity. Fundamental to the Hebrew belief was the idea that God created people not to be his slaves, but to fulfill their duty by freely choosing to follow or not follow his law. They considered themselves to be his chosen people, who were to become the moral teachers of humanity. They modified a Hittite concept, the suzerainty treaty or covenant, to explain the relationship between God and the tribes. The suzerainty treaty covenant is regularly spoken of as that which the sovereign gave his vassal, which is the sovereign's covenant. In exchange for protection and a relative amount of freedom, the greater government required the smaller government. His vassal, a steady supply of revenue and manpower assistance, should the greater government, the suzerain, be attacked from the outside.